Hello. He's starting a new chapter in Church History in Plain Language by Bruce Shelley. We're now on chapter 22, A Song to Lady Poverty, Francis and the Apostolic Lifestyle. Everyone we know loves a lover. Songs of endless devotion are not new. The ballads of the troubadours filled the 20th century. The 12th century. They were all about courtly love, gallant knights, sinister magicians, enchanted castles, talking animals, and always beautiful damsels. Perhaps that is why so many felt drawn to St. Francis of Assisi. His song was of Lady Poverty, his ideal for true Christianity and personal holiness. Early in his preaching career, Christ's very courageous knight, as his first biography called him, gave himself devoted ardently to poverty. According to one of many stories told about him, Francis, with some companions, went out in search of poverty. Two old men told Francis that she lived high in the mountains. Scaling the peaks, Francis found her there, on the throne of her neediness. She welcomed the travelers, and Francis immediately praised her as the Queen of the Virtues. She replied that she had indeed been with Adam in paradise, but after he sinned, she had become a homeless wanderer. Then Jesus came. He made her his elect one, and through her believers multiplied. Monks especially joined her until her enemy, avarice, made them rich and worldly. Then she no longer had a choice. She withdrew from monasticism. Upon hearing Poverty's story, Francis vowed to be faithful to her. He took her as his bride, and she descended the mountain with him. Francis was not the only spiritual knight devoted to Lady Poverty. In the 12th and 13th centuries, she had a host of admirers. Itinerant preaching and voluntary poverty appealed to the imagination and conscience of many Christians. Growing numbers of laymen, instead of relying on the prayers of monks and bishops, read the Bible in the vernacular and vowed to follow the gospel mandate. Sell what you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. Some of these believers chose orthodoxy, others opted for heresy, and at times only a knife's edge seemed to separate the two. One thing was clear. Innocent III's vision of the ascended Christ who ruled through his vicar all nations, all learning, and all grace in this life and the next faced a formidable rival in the ancient image of the Savior who said, "Foxes have holes and birds have air, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Where, after all, is true Christianity? In a sacramental institution or in a self-denying lifestyle? Next section is poverty, heresy, and violence. The medieval poverty movement is a timeless reminder that political Christianity is only partial Christianity. The Christian faith is more than papal policy, much more. What shall it profit the church, to paraphrase Jesus, to gain the world and lose her soul? What advantage are canon laws, holy crusades, episcopal appointments, and scholastic disputations if common people receive a stone when asking for bread? The gospel of voluntary poverty drew its strength from a deep and widespread resentment of a corrupt and neglectful priesthood. The back to the apostles movement was often allied with political and economic restlessness in a rapidly changing and expanding society, but at its heart was people's spiritual hunger. At a time when it was desperately needed, pastoral care was a lost art. Robert Crosetist, the able bishop of Lincoln in England from 1235 to 1253, decried the covetousness, greed, and immorality of the clergy. As the life of pastors is the book of the laity, it is manifest that such as these are the preachers of all errors and wickedness. End quote. And the foundation of all this, said Grossetist, is the Roman court. It appoints not pastors, but destroyers of people. Grossetist's complaint had a familiar ring to it. As early as the 10th century, monastic reformers had called for a return to the poverty of the early church. Every zealous preacher knew that if apostolic poverty is the Christian ideal, then bishops in their embellished palaces and monks in their wealthy cloisters were not living the Christian life. In early centuries, however, all such appeals to sacrifice were conveniently channeled into some new monastic reform. Within the church itself, it was business as usual. The 12th and 13th centuries proved to be different. Not all preachers of apostolic poverty were willing to remain within the acceptable boundaries of the church. When they turned against the church, they entered the ranks of heretics. Modern Western Christians find it all but impossible to understand the medieval attitude towards heresy. We assume that religious faith is a matter of personal choice, but we seldom think of doctrine and religious beliefs as life and death matters. Why should anyone either die for their own faith or kill another for theirs? Medieval Christians, however, never considered faith strictly private. Christian beliefs were the cement of society. Denying a doctrine was tantamount to treason. Christendom was, to shift the image, a socio-political body, and the Christian faith was itself life-giving soul. And the Christian faith was its life-giving soul. So heresy in Christendom was no more acceptable than cancer in the flesh. To an extent, they had a point. Meaning, like, what the majority of people are led to believe does matter. But what is heresy? In the 12th century, it was the denial by a baptized person of any revealed truth of the Christian faith. Among these truths were the unity of the church and the divine appointments of the Pope as head of the Christian body. Therefore, disobedience to established authority was itself heresy. In dealing with heretics, then, the church had two primary objectives. First, the conversion of the heretic, and second, the protection of Christian society. But how far can the church go to protect society? Is it right to take a life to protect other lives? Heresy drove the Catholic Church to her most serious internal conflict. How can the church employ violence to safeguard a peaceful society? The church deliberately accepted a line of action. The real question, well, there's a lot of real questions. I'm going to not be a commentary on this right now. Where was I? I just want to clarify, I'm not, when I said that they had a point, I did not mean that it's a good idea to kill people as heretics. But I do agree that it does matter what people believe, because it affects society. Okay, found my spot. I'm gonna actually I'm gonna reread part of the section, because then we'll be more in line with, like, it'll be more flowy. Heresy drove the Catholic Church to her most serious internal conflict. How can the church employ violence to safeguard a peaceful society? The church deliberately accepted a line of action, all but impossible to reconcile with the eternal kingdom toward which she aspired. She created the Inquisition, not only to execute heretics, but to subject them to deliberate and prolonged torture. In driving out one devil, the church opened the door for 7 others. When I said I was going to reread the section again, I actually ended up reading just the section right below it. But the last part that I read before that was, is it right to take a life to protect other lives? And then that next section. Okay. The contradiction was not widely apparent at the time. The same church that sent crusading armies against the infidels could command the burning of heretics. Almost everyone agreed that a pure church was the will of God. But they're ruining the purity of the church while doing that. All right. That's my commentary, even though I said I wasn't going to give any more. I'll refrain from the rest of this. The next section, the poor in the kingdom. But where is the one pure church? Is it in the papal palace in Rome? Is it in the blood of crusading armies, or in the sale of indulgences to the poor? What if the one pure church is in none of these, but is in fact in the hungry who find bread, the naked who are clothed, the stranger who finds rest? What if the kingdom of heaven does not belong to the poor? What if the kingdom of heaven does belong to the poor in spirit? That was the question Lady Poverty raised. One of the earliest voices against the worldliness of the Catholic Church was Arnold, who was an abbot at Brescia, a town in northern Italy. In a series of sermons there, Arnold insisted that clerical vice was a result of the church's attempt to control the world. He urged the church to surrender its property and secular dominion to the state and return to the poverty and simplicity of the early church. The true church and its ministers, he said, should shun wealth, for wealth and power nullify salvation. By 1139, Arnold succeeded in turning the people against their bishop. For this, the Pope Innocent II, banished Arnold from Italy. He apparently fled to Paris, where he studied under Abelard, and aroused the wrath of Bernard of Clairvaux, just as his teacher had succeeded in doing. Another ravening wolf in sheep's clothing, Bernard called him. After 5 years in exile, Arnold showed up in Rome and immediately joined a movement to overthrow papal dominion. The Romans, filled with dreams of the ancient Roman Republic, seized power during the Pope's preaching tour for the Second Crusade, and Arnold stepped into leadership of the new, purely secular government. He preached that clergy should live in apostolic poverty, and he denounced the College of Cardinals as a den of thieves. The experiment lasted about 10 years before Pope Hadrian IV placed Rome under an interdict and secured the help of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in capturing Arnold. In 1155, he was executed by burning, and his ashes were thrown into the Tiber River. People had scarcely forgotten Arnold when another voice for poverty arose in eastern France. Peter Waldo, who lived from 1140 to 1218, a rich merchant of Lyons. One day, Waldo heard a wandering troubadour singing the virtues of the monastic life. The ballad was about young Alexis, whose patrician Roman parents pressed him into marriage. The reluctant groom, however, was dedicated to the ideal of chastity, so on his wedding night he made a pact of virgin purity with his bride and immediately left for the Holy Land. Alexis's parents searched for him in vain. Years later, he returned home a beggar, so emancipated from his life of self-denial that no one recognized him. He existed in the courtyard on scraps from the family table. That's a terrible idea and makes you have to be taken care of by others. My last comment. Only as he lay dying did he reveal his true identity. Too late for the grieving family to claim him. The moral was pointed. A true Christian must be willing to sacrifice everything in this life for the sake of the next. Struck to the heart by the story, Waldo sought a priest to find out how to live like Christ. The priest turned him to the answer Jesus gave to the rich young ruler. If you want to be perfect, go, sell your house, sell your possessions, and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. That's Matthew 19:21. The same text 9 centuries before had launched the monastic movement with Anthony in Egypt. Waldo decided to follow the counsel. He provided an adequate income for his wife, placed his 2 daughters in a cloister, and gave the rest of his estate to the poor. To launch his mission to the poor, Waldo enlisted 2 priests to translate portions of the Bible into French. After memorizing long passages, Waldo began to teach common folk to imitate Christ by practicing voluntary poverty. Thus, his innovations lay in applying the life of poverty, discipleship, and preaching to all true Christians, not just monks. As he gained a few followers, Waldo sent them out 2 by 2 after the apostolic pattern into villages and marketplaces to teach and explain the scriptures. They called themselves the poor in spirit. We know them as Waldinians. Waldo's unauthorized preaching soon met the stiff opposition of the Archbishop of Lyons, who ordered him to stop. Waldo refused, quoting St. Peter, "We must obey God rather than human beings." That's Acts 5:29. The Archbishop excommunicated him. Waldo and his followers decided to appeal to the Pope. They arrived in Rome and found it crowded with church officials attending the Third Lateran Council, 1179. They were able to gain a hearing before the council, but had the misfortune to be ridiculed by a smooth, fast-talking Englishman named Walter Map. Pope Alexander III found no evidence of heresy among them and was impressed by their poverty. They were mere laymen, however, not ordained, so he ruled that they could preach only by the invitation of bishops, an unlikely prospect. Waldo was convinced that the scriptures commanded him to preach to the poor with or without bishop's approval. Along with a growing number of followers, he continued to preach and practice apostolic poverty. The movement spread into southern France and across the Alps into Italy. By 1184, their disobedience compelled Pope Lucius III to excommunicate them from the Holy Catholic Church. The conflict is understandable. The Waldensians wanted to purify the church by a return to the simple life of the apostles. This meant the surrender of worldly power. Their aim, like that of the Roman Church, was salvation, but their means were radically different. The papacy could not renounce its sacraments or its priesthood, nor admit that faith in God might be something other than the mandates of Rome. From their side, the Waldensians came to believe more and more that no teaching except Christ's was binding. The scriptures must rule. But how could they find support for their cause if everyone lived in apostolic poverty? Slowly, they came to accept, just as early monastic houses did, two levels of Christian commitment. The poor in spirit, the society proper, was bound by special vows and worshiped together in simple services. Another circle of friends remained in the Catholic Church but supplied recruits and support for the movement. The Waldensians, the Waldensians, is that a typo? Well, there's an S instead of a D on part of this. Were so clearly a back to the Bible movement that over the years many evangelical Christians have tried to present them as reformers before the Reformation. Compared with the Roman Church's doctrine of papal authority, the Waldensians' call to return to the Bible does indeed sound like Luther or Calvin. But their view of salvation, a life of penance and poverty, lacks the clear note of God's grace that sounded so powerfully in the Reformation. Next section is the peril of new heresies. Going to take a drink. Alrighty. A third dissenting movement, and by far the most troublesome for the Catholic Church, was the group commonly called Cathari. Cathari, that's a weird name, which means pure ones, since they were especially influential around the town of Albi in southern France. Some people call them Albigenses. Okay. Most of what we know about the it's Albigenses. I'm going to call them Albigenses. Comes through their enemies, and as Charles Williams once observed, not one mind in 1,000 can be trusted to state accurately what one's opponent says, much less what he thinks. Very likely, however, the Cathari infiltrated Europe from Bulgaria, where one of their chief branches bore the name Bogomilus. Like the Gnostics in the early church, the Cathari held that the universe is the scene of an eternal conflict between two powers, one good and the other evil. This sounds like an Eastern religion. Matter, including the human body, is the work of this evil power. Also sounds like an Eastern religion. The God of the Old Testament, so that's the evil one, I guess they thought. I don't think they had like an Eastern influence. He had, referring to God, the God of the Old Testament, they claimed, imprisoned the human soul in its earthly body. To escape from the power of the flesh, the true Cathar was supposed to avoid marriage, sexual intercourse, the eating of meat, and marital possessions. Material possessions, not marital. Here was a radical poverty, but one based not so much on the example of Jesus as on the nature of the universe. A cosmic civil war raged between matter and the spirit, and the Cathari joined the ranks of the spirit. The good God, they taught, sent Christ to reveal the way of salvation. Christ to the Cathar was not a human being, but a life-giving spirit. A human Christ was an impossibility, and salvation by death on the cross was unthinkable. Christ taught the way like a Buddha rather than rather than the God-man of the Christian creeds. If this description is true, the Cathari were heretical in a way Arnold and Brescia and Peter Waldo were not. Arnold and Waldo refused to submit to church authorities, but Cathari rejected not only popes and bishops, but basic Christianity. They tried to escape from evil, not by repentance and faith, but by dividing the self in two. Now we have a Profiles of Faith section, which I will read. I might put the image up on the screen later if I decide to edit. Julian of Norwich, from 1342 to 1416, was an English anchoress, a woman who had set herself apart for God and lived isolated in a cell. That sounds so stupid. I'm tired today, so I'm more likely to just ramble about my thoughts on these things. It's just not, it doesn't make sense. Okay. During a serious illness in which she believed herself to be dying, Julian received a series of 16 revelations or shewings in which she beheld Christ and saw the meaning of his sufferings. In this life, sin and suffering are needful, she wrote, but Christ promised her that all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. Her visions and meditations recorded in Revelations of Divine Love served as a classic of Christian mysticism and are additionally notable for their emphasis on God's maternal nature. And we have this inscription of this statue that's made of her. It says, "Modern sculpture of Julian of Norwich, at Norwich Cathedral, Norfolk, England." All right, back to the main content. The Cathari were an immense peril to the Roman Church. Not only had they revived the ancient dualist heresy, by 1200 they had gained the protection of the princes of Toulouse, a cultural area in southern France, and were spreading at an alarming rate. 3 weapons were at the Catholic Church's disposal: preaching to return them to the truth, a crusade to crush all hardened resistance, and the Inquisition to uproot heresy. We have next section is called The Rise of the Dominicans. The Pope tried sending preachers among the Cathari, but they were notoriously ineffective, at least until a Spaniard named Dominic Guzman, who lived from 1170 to 1221, struck upon the reason. In 1206, Dominic was helping in efforts to convert the Albigenses when he realized that the papally assigned preachers were depending on their ecclesiastical pomp and dignity. The Albigenses considered such show a sure sign of false religion. Dominic believed that the heretics would listen if the preachers themselves were committed to poverty. It's a wise move. To win the heretics, Dominic went forth among them as a poor man, barefoot and begging. That seems like a bit much, but Dominic's peaceful mission lasted only 2 years in southern France before it was forced aside by Innocent III's get touch policy, not get in touch. However, the zealous Spaniard was convinced that poverty and preaching belonged together. He gathered a group of like-minded men and continued his work among the heretics and other places. In 1220, the Dominican mission and lifestyle gained official approval. The new preaching order that we know as Dominicans was called mendicant, meaning begging, and the term friar or brother distinguished them from monks because, unlike monks, they went forth to live among people, to preach and teach. Just as monastic houses had once arisen to minister in the countryside, so the mendicant friars now emerged to meet the spiritual needs of townspeople. Meanwhile, Innocent III was determined to crush the Albigensian heresy. The northern French were itching for a chance to gobble up southern France, which was then a separate country. When Innocent called for a crusade, not against the Muslim Turks, but against Christian heretics, the northern French came pillaging and murdering. It isn't often that good Christian rulers can save their souls and at the same time enlarge their kingdoms by killing those of deficient doctrine. Yeah, okay. Even Innocent was shocked by their brutality, but the crusade was eminently successful. By 1215, the Albigenses were uprooted in Toulouse, and the northern French had claimed the ravaged territory of the south. Next section is Enter the Inquisition. The scattered heretics had to be hounded out of hiding. That was the purpose of the Inquisition. The infamy of this institution has left its mark on the memories and vocabularies of people everywhere. There's even a game about it. Assassin's Creed. We equate it with the ruthless miscarriage of justice. The early form of the Inquisition appeared in 1184. Every time I see 1184, I start saying 18 for some reason. The early form of the Inquisition appeared in 1184 when Pope Lucius III required bishops to inquire into the beliefs of their subjects. They held an inquiry or inquest. Heresy or the harboring of a heretic brought immediate excommunication. The spread of the Waldenses and Albigenses, however, called for stricter measures. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, Lateran, I don't know if it's pronounced Lateran or Lateran, probably Lateran, under Innocent III's leadership, provided for the state's punishment of heretics, the confiscation of their property, excommunication for those unwilling to move against the heretics, and complete forgiveness of sins for those cooperating. In 1220, the Pope took the Inquisition from the hands of the bishops and turned it over to the newly formed Dominicans. And 9 years later, the Synod of Toulouse systemized inquisitorial policies, leaving an alleged heretic with virtually no rights. The inquisitor was subject to no law, only to the Pope. He was investigator, prosecutor, and judge. The trial was secret, and the accused had to prove his innocence, as in all courts following Roman law, without the benefit of counsel or knowledge of his accusers. The final significant step came in 1252. Pope Innocent IV authorized torture as a means of getting information and confessions from accused heretics. Popes, saints, and theologians had in the past rejected with horror the very thought, but no such reserve remained after Innocent III had ascended the papal throne and the Catholic Church had achieved its majestic and powerful unity. Canon law, it is true, forbade a cleric from shedding blood. He who served the altars of the one sacrifice must not sacrifice a human being. He could only hound and interrogate and torture the prisoner. Oof. If he found the unfortunate person guilty of heresy, he turned him over to civil authorities, usually for burning at the stake. It was an ugly business, and almost everyone, after Augustine, agreed that saving the body by amputating a rotten limb was the path of wisdom. Clergy, the Church of Rome, clearly the Church of Rome was the body and the heretic the rotten limb. The combination of the crusade against heresy in Toulouse and the Inquisition brought an end to Catharism before the 13th century closed. The doctrine that matter was incapable of salvation was, until the coming of Mary Baker Eddy, a thing of the past. The Waldensians, who were often targets of the same Inquisition, survived in the mountains of Italy and welcomed the Reformation when it broke over Europe in the 16th century. The Inquisition also survived, even with its serious weakness. It could amputate, but it could not heal. The ministry of healing arose in a village surrounded by vineyards 85 miles north of Rome. Assisi was the hometown of Giovanni Bernardone, who we know him as St. Francis of Assisi, and I'm going to call him that from now on because I don't know how to say the other name. Francis, who lived from 1182 to 1226, was the son of a wealthy Italian cloth merchant. Francis's father had dreams of knighthood for his son. One minor military campaign, however, was enough for Francis. Perhaps while racked with fever in prison, after being captured in battle, Francis meditated on the meaning of life, had a series of visions, and determined to turn his back on the world and his father's dreams. The reorientation was dramatic. Previously, he benefited from wealth, saw honor, and was repulsed by illness like leprosy. With Christ as his model, he abandoned the security of wealth, lived a humble life dedicated to benefiting others, and embraced lepers. Leaving home in a ragged cloak and a rope belt taken from a scarecrow, he wandered the countryside with a few followers, begging from the rich, giving to the poor, and preaching the joys of faith amid poverty. Next section is founding the Franciscans. In 1209, Francis prepared a simple rule for his little brotherhood. It consisted chiefly of Christ's appeal to take up the cross, his advice to the rich young ruler, and his directions on sending out the apostles. With this rule, Francis and his companions went to Pope Innocent III for approval. The scene was almost a reproduction of Waldo before Alexander III in 1179. But times had changed. Innocent saw the mistake others had made, so he approved the little preaching band. Francis called this group the Friars Minors, lesser brothers. We call them the Franciscans. Almost from the start, Francis's vision was for the world. He tried to go to Syria and to Morocco, but was thwarted. Then, in 1219, a crusading expedition to Egypt gave him his opportunity. With 11 companions, he accompanied the army to the Middle East, where he met with the Sultan of Egypt and tried to convert him, but was unsuccessful. From Egypt, he visited the holy places in Palestine, and it was more than a year before he saw Italy again. We have here an image, which I might put on the screen later. It says, depiction of Francis and his companions receiving the approval of the rule from Pope Innocent III. Here you go. Hopefully you can sort of see it. I will probably add it to the video later. During his absence, differences arose among the brothers. Some felt that their rapid growth demanded more organization, more rules, more supervision. Others tried to cling to the simple, original principles of Christ-like poverty. Upon Francis's return to Italy, he saw that the problems were more than he could handle. He was a model, not a manager. So he appealed to the Pope to appoint Cardinal Ugolino as his advisor, and soon he surrendered the administration of the brotherhood to his associate, Peter de Cattaneo. Lord Jesus, he prayed, I give thee back this family which thou didst entrust to me. Thou knowest that I have no longer the strength or the ability to take care of it. End quote. It is a familiar scene in Christian organizations. The founder establishes, another administers. Ugolino, who later became Pope Gregory IX, admired Francis greatly, but he was above all a prince of the church. He saw the possibilities of the movement as an agent for the advancement of the church, especially where its authority had been undermined by Arnold, Waldo, and the Cathari. He would reform the church by giving the Franciscans authority. Francis wanted to reform the world, not by power, but by practicing and preaching Christ-like humility. That's a good idea. Okay, then we have a profile of faith. This is Clare of Assisi, and this is 1194 to 1253. Clare of Assisi slipped out of her father's house when she was 18 years old and fled to Francis of Assisi's community. She had heard him preaching and wanted to give her life to prayer and poverty. Francis cut off her hair, gave her a rough robe to wear, and sent her to live with the Benedictine community. When a dwelling had been constructed next to San Damiano, Clare, who was joined by her sister Agnes, moved there and began what was known as the Poor Ladies of San Damiano, a female version of the Franciscans. Despite the church's attempts to conform the sisters and the women who joined them to a more common Benedictine order, they remained true to the teachings and modeled the lifestyle of Francis. Some have called her the female Francis. 2 days before her death, the Pope recognized her order, and 10 days before her death, her order was reaffirmed as the Order of St. Clare. All right, back to the regular content. In 1223, Pope Honorius III confirmed a new rule for the order, which allowed for an elaborate organization and made begging a fundamental trait of the order. Thus, Franciscans joined the Dominicans in a great mendicants' counter-offensive in preaching doctrine and dedication. Francis lived to see his ideal changed. He feared the spread of worldly power to his followers, lest the service of the poor be neglected. As his end drew near, he was carried back to Assisi and died there on October 3rd, 1226, in full humility and song. Francis was a product of his age, a lover of Lady Poverty, but he belonged to all the Christian centuries. For a few years, he wrote Herbert Workman. The Sermon on the Mount became a realized fact, but the dream passed. That's a quotation. He wrote Herbert Workman, start quote, the Sermon on the Mount became a realized fact, but the dream passed, end quote, from all but a few. For another century, the Franciscans were divided between the Covenantals, who allowed the church to hold property for Franciscan use, and the Spirituals, who argued that complete poverty was an indispensable note of the true church. Thus, Lady Poverty remained a challenge to the church of wealth and power. But like Innocent III's vision of universal dominion, it proved an impossibility for the whole church for all time. The end.